I assume if you're still watching videos at this point in our conversation that you are heavily dedicated to the work of reconciliation and learning about reconciliation and practicing reconciliation. And so one of the important lessons that we need to add, and this is kind of on a personal level, a lot of these lessons relate to how do we relate to others, how do we bridge between our world and theirs. At the same time, there's a personal way in which we interact with this. And I want to talk about rest and celebration. Very quickly in any kind of Christian work, we can lose ourselves to the work of the problem. So if we say, well, I'm going to address poverty, we throw ourselves in 110% and we address poverty. And a friend of mine, he does a lot of counseling. He talks about people in his city who go, you know what, no one works harder than me in this city. I'm going to be the hardest working person on this team. And we say that like it's a virtue, and I know I've been there, but this isn't always best. And when we're dealing with conflict, when we're in an area that needs reconciliation, oftentimes there's much more, there are deeper levels, right? So conflict begins or can begin at a cognitive level, at a behavioral level, and an emotional level. And so we might have an intellectual conflict with someone, we might have a physical conflict with someone, it might be emotional. But any conflict will typically possess those three forms. Perhaps not the physical in every single one, but at least a cognitive and emotional go together. And so the emotional one takes toll on us when we're lying down. And if we're trying to help others, these are problems oftentimes that we take home with us. And so when we lose ourselves in the work, we become a different kind of person. Earlier on, I mentioned the Robert Schreider quote that reconciliation is a process of transformation in both the victim and the perpetrator. They're both being transformed in this process. And so a reverse transformation can happen as well, though, where we are so focused on the work that we lose the foundation, we lose the life spring, if you will, of what gives us the ability to do this. I've argued that racial reconciliation is a byproduct of God's spiritual power flowing through us. And if we go to Jesus' conversation about the vine and the branches, if we are cut off from the vine, we can do nothing. And so if we're focused only on doing rather than who we're becoming, we're going to create problems. Even if the work we're doing is initially good, at some point it is just going to be a house built on sand. And so as new creations, who we are becoming in Christ will change what we are doing. And so we have to keep that connection to the vine, to the spring. We have to stay connected to Christ. That has to be our focus. And so it might seem weird to talk about rest and celebration, but this becomes very, very important. In any family, I'm sure yours is no different than mine, there are a number of crises that you might face in a given generation or lifetime. And I know my family has gone through many of these. And when you're in the thick of the fight, sometimes that's all you can see. It's like being in a forest where you just can only see what's right there in front of you and you can't see an open field 100 yards away. And sometimes this becomes all that you can think about and you become fixated on this. And there's no room for anything else. And apart from this initial problem becomes this second layer, sort of like strata of rock, right? Level 1 is the problem that started it all, the other person, what they did. But level 2 becomes the fomenting that you have been doing, that I have been doing as you're dealing with the problem and the people who are related to the problem. And so this just creates a downward spiral. So this is why rest and celebration are important, is this gives us time away from the problem to not empty our mind of everything, but to empty our mind of the problem and to focus on our relationship with Christ, our walk with Christ. I want to remind you of a couple of really interesting facts about the Bible, how God uses meal times, rest times, feast times. And so all through the Old Testament, there were these times of festivals and feasting, often in response to something that had happened to them. Somebody once summarized Jewish history and said, here's the summary of Jewish history. They tried to kill us, we won, let's eat. And if you think through different feasts, a lot of them actually really follow that model. It's a commemoration of we didn't die. And so if we think through, God brought his people out of slavery in Egypt. The first thing he has them do, share a meal, even out in the wilderness. When they get into the promised land, one of the first things they do, they commemorate it with a meal. Jesus leaves his disciples, and the thing that he gives them to commemorate his memory is a meal. Now I know during our communion services, it is not a meal, but if you think back to the Corinthian church, whatever they had on the table was enough for them to be accused of being drunkards and gluttons. And so they were not just eating the little tiny wafers that are so common in our church. There was a meal involved. And finally, when we get to heaven, we're going to sit down and Jesus is going to serve us. He's going to feed us. He's the chef. He's everything. And so we're going to commemorate our time beginning in heaven with a meal. Christine Pohl wrote a book called Living into Community, and she has spent her entire book interviewing different communities that practice hospitality. And she quotes this story from a Christian worker who was working with refugees in Latin America. And she says this. She says, as soon as the refugees began to make a new camp, they set up 3 committees: education, construction, and joy. Celebration was basic to the life of the refugees as teaching their children to read or build a latrine. One of the refugees challenged the church worker for being overly focused on her tasks and said, "You're not serious about our struggle. Only people who expect to go back to North America in a year work the way you do. You cannot be serious about the struggle unless you play and celebrate and do those things that make it possible to give a lifetime to it." I think these words are very true of a lot of us. For those who do engage in any kind of church activity, in any kind of mission activity, very quickly we become consumed by the work itself, to the degree that someone who is from a celebration culture would say, you don't intend to do this very long because the pace you are keeping can only be kept for a couple of years. And this is so true. We see pastors burn out. We see teachers burn out. We see volunteers burn out. We see missionaries burn out. There's a high burnout rate because we very quickly replace our worship of Jesus, our relationship with Jesus, and we take something that he loves quite dearly, that is part of his, I would say, his very nature, which is missions or reconciliation. These are things that we do because this is what makes him happy. This is what he does. But when we take him off the throne and we put missions on the throne, or we put reconciliation on the throne, or conflict resolution, immediately we start having the same problems as if we had put drugs, alcohol, illicit affairs, power, money, put any of those kind of secular idols that we talk about. If we put our Christian idols up there, it will have the same effect in our life. And so through the course of these conversations, I hope that you are taking time to rest and to celebrate what God has been doing through your work.